Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to have you here today. Today is the Friday Forum. It's the last Friday Forum for the month of August. I've been doing one every week as kind of a back to school special to help get us kick-started into the new school year and before we really launch into a super busy season that we all have. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more at the end about what's in store in future times. But I'm so pleased today to have a full panel of experts to talk to you. As I mentioned, my name is Cyndy McDonald. I'm an educator, an entrepreneur, and a traveler. And I know we have somebody in our midst today who's also been a traveler. And so he's coming to us from a remote location. And we're going to talk about test and test prep. We're going to talk about the new National Test Preparation Organization. And I have Mike Bergin from Chariot Learning. He is the president of the National Test Preparation. David Blobaum from Summit Test Prep. He is the director of outreach for the National Test Preparation. And Mackenzie Lee, who is the founder of Testology. And he is also a member, a very important member of
Esteemed,
the
you might say.
esteemed member, there we
You
go,
might say.
of the National Test Prep Organization. So as you're coming in, please put your name and your location so that they can see where you're from. And as always, if you have a question, put the question in the Q&A. We have Carmen Gallego. She's back at school. She's with us today. So she's going to be monitoring the chat and managing questions and things. So I'm really glad to see many people here taking a little bit of a break on this Friday just before the Labor Day weekend. And so I'm just really pleased to have everyone here today. So as everyone's coming in and putting in their name and their location, let's do a few introductions and just tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you became a part of the National Test Prep Organization. So Mackenzie, let's start with you.
So my name is Mackenzie Lee. I recently, it was only about a year and a few months ago that I joined the National Test Prep Association. I found out about it through a Facebook group of all places, and the one for Mike's podcast, Mike and Amy Seeley. And I found out they were having a conference in Dallas last June. And I hopped on a plane about a month later and I met some of the best people I've ever met. Talked about some exciting things in test prep and was able to really connect with people who are sort of tuned in the way that I am, that we all are with test prep.
That's great. That's great. Mike, let's go to you next.
I'm Mike Bergin. Thanks for having me, Cyndy. I have been in education for over 30 years, been in test prep a long time. I founded Chariot Learning in Rochester, New York, back in 2009. I am the co-host, as Mackenzie mentioned, of the Test and the Rest podcast, which all of our panelists and our host have been on. I am the founding president of the National Test Prep Association. I'm the creator of the Test Bright SAT, ACT curriculum, the Roots to Words, Word of the Day. I'm really excited about education, and I do a lot of things in this space.
That's great. What about you, David?
So when you talk to a lot of tutors, you'll hear a very long and weird road to how they got into tutoring. So mine's the same. When I graduated from the University of Chicago, I was waiting on a long scope background check from the CIA to finish up. So I thought, hey, I'll just tutor, for a couple months in the interim. Started tutoring, absolutely loved it. Loved teaching standardized tests because you don't just teach one subject matter, you get to teach grammar, mathematics, reading, data analysis. So fell in love with it even before the 6 to 12 months of the background check was up. I withdrew my preliminary job offer, said, hey, I'm going to do this full time. And 14 years later, no regrets. I've helped hundreds of students and 2 tutoring locations with a team of tutors now. So we've helped thousands of students just get a better foundational academic preparedness for college and help them succeed in life. And then with the National Test Prep Association, it's the premier organization for tutors. So I got involved because I studied sociology in college. I wanted to prioritize access for students. So the National Test Prep Association advocates for the appropriate use of testing for college admissions. So that was the sweet spot for me. And I've been a director of outreach for the last 3 years now.
Wow. So you gave up CIA to become a tutor?
Yes. And I mean, in retrospect, it actually seems like an easy decision because it hits all the sweet spots of you get to nerd out and learn a lot. You get to teach students. It's a very meaningful vocation. So no regrets at all.
That is fantastic. I must say, I was very surprised that there wasn't a national test prep organization until recently. When was it founded? Mike, when did you found the organization?
To be fair, Cyndy, we were surprised as well, which is why we had to create it. So we first came up with the idea of forming a national industry nonprofit back in 2020. And we put together the work group to launch the organization, but then something happened in the spring of 2020 that demanded all of our attention.
You know what that
was? It put our formal launch on hold until 2021, but we were actually up and running through 2020. We all had ample time to connect on Zoom and kind of create the blueprint of what we wanted the organization to be like. And, so though we launched formally in 2021, we've been holding in-person events for 3 years, and we really grew quickly. And we're just expanding as more and more educators find out that this organization actually exists.
I think that's fantastic. And as someone that helped start an organization, I know the time and effort and the heart that goes into that. So congratulations. And so you mentioned COVID, and we know during COVID, many colleges went test optional. But in the past 6 months, which colleges have reinstated testing requirements?
I think David is ready to rattle them off at any moment.
I mean, there's quite a few that actually came as quite a surprise that we're test optional. Now they've come back and said, oh, well, by the way, we're going to now require tests. So what are some of those schools?
Good question. So there's Harvard, there's Brown, there's Cornell, there's Dartmouth, there's Yale. There's a couple that have even just recently announced. So there's Johns Hopkins said in the next cycle, there'll be tests required. I believe just yesterday, Carnegie Mellon said for next cycle, there'll be tests required. There's UT Austin. There's actually far more than we can keep track of. So there's a link that we can put in the show notes. It's from CollegeVine. It's 122 colleges that have gone back to test required. So too many to name. And also, I mean, there's MIT, there's Georgetown. Caltech actually went from test free, skipped over test optional, went all the way back to test required. So there's more than I can remember off the top of my head.
Well, that's the point too, right? That there are a lot of schools that have gone back to that. And what are the reasons that they're giving? I know, Dartmouth had a report and said, these are the reasons that we've cited to go back to testing. And I've had other conversations about that as well. So what are the reasons and what are your feelings about that? Are they substantiated or not?
I can feel that as well. So it's kind of my jam. So first thing that I want to know is it seems completely counter intuitive, especially for a lot of people in the admission space, that colleges would go back to test requiring. Because what do colleges get out of that? It's very unpopular and it drives down their number of applications. So because it seems against their best interest to do so, we take their reasons very seriously. I personally believe their reasons. So they've given 3 primary reasons. Their first primary reason that they've given is transparency. So colleges found that despite the fact that they themselves said they were truly test optional, it turns out they actually weren't. So Cornell, Dartmouth, Yale, and others have actually explicitly stated that when they controlled for all other factors, they found their own admission staff was giving a preference to students with high test scores. So Jeremiah Quinlan, he's the director of admissions for Yale. He said on the Yale podcast explicitly that he felt they weren't being truthful to students by being test optional. So just as a matter of truthfulness and integrity, some colleges have gone back and said, hey, if we really behind the scenes give a preference for high test scores, we're just going to say, we prefer test scores, and so we're just going to require them. So first was transparency. The second was that these colleges have also shown that there has been a divergence in performance between students who submitted test scores and those who didn't. When you actually look at the data, it's a little bit harder to figure out, though, because if you just look just at GPA, it doesn't tell the whole story. You really need to do an apples to apples comparison, meaning students in the same major who submitted and didn't submit. That's when you see a very high divergence, because you see a lot of students who didn't submit test scores and they might be doing worse in a pre-med track. Well, they don't stay in that pre-med track then. They might go into a major that gives out more easy A's. I'll pick on sociology. I'm a sociology major. So they might go into sociology, which just to be honest, more students get A's into sociology, right? So then we see that their GPA bounces back in second year, but that's really, if they had been forced to stay in the pre-med track, there would have been more of a divergence. So to put some numbers behind that, though, Yale has said that if you go just based on high school GPA explains 9% of a student's GPA at Yale. If you go just based on test scores, SAT and ACT scores, that explains 22% of a student's GPA at Yale. So those SAT, ACT scores alone were more than twice as predictive. So Harvard, Brown, and Yale are on record saying that the most predictive measure in the entire admissions process for how a student will do in college is an SAT and ACT score. So for those colleges that have made the decision, we're going to prioritize academic success over high application numbers or other priorities, they've said we're going to require test scores. And then the third is really MIT led the way in this, is saying it's really a case of equity. So Yale, MIT, Dartmouth, they've said that test optional admissions is very confusing for students. When do I submit? When do I not submit? What they found is that under-resourced students were actually not submitting test scores that would have helped them. Because we know that it's those under-resourced students who they might have a very hard time standing out from their circumstances. So it was actually the SAT and ACT score that could help those students get in, even if that score was below the college's median. So they said, just as a matter of equity, we don't want to miss out on those students who would stand out from their circumstances with a high SAT, ACT score. So we're going to require them. So it really came down to transparency, academic performance, and then equity.
So, well, and I understand the transparency for sure. The other things I think, looking at the data and evaluating that it sounds to me like there needs to be more studies and more, data to go with that. Carmen, you have a question.
Yeah, so if the only reason that these colleges are going back to test required is because of honesty, could they solve this problem by going test blind?
I mean, as David pointed out, there's more than one reason. And to be fair, there is a big gap. If we want to talk about honesty or transparency, you have the test-free, we won't say test blind, we'll say SAT, ACT blind schools. And then we have the test mandatory, SAT, ACT mandatory schools. They represent a small fraction of all the schools in the system. We still have this valley that test optional spans a myriad of different interpretations from 20% of last year's incoming class submitted scores to 80% of last year's incoming class submitted scores. We still have a long way to go for true transparency and honesty.
Yeah, and that is true. Having worked with students in all sorts of different circumstances and in our technology too, when you look at test optional, there's like 20 different variations on what that is. Your grades are a certain height, or whatever the circumstances are, then you don't have to submit test scores. I want to go back to the concept of one of the things in Dartmouth is cited equity, and you talked about equity, David, and they talked about score strength. So that's something you were just referencing. So tell us a little more about score strength, and is this a new concept?
So score strength is the phrase that Dartmouth used explicitly in their announcement to describe exactly how they're interpreting scores as they come in for students. So a lot of students, parents, families have this misinterpretation of the way that these scores are looked at by colleges, that a 1350 is a 1350 whoever it comes from, and that's not true whatsoever, right? So a 1350, or let's say a 1450 coming from a school that averages 1100, 1150, something like this, will look like it'll be a really strong supplement to that application probably. And this is what David was referencing a second ago, where these students who are coming from these schools look at the middle 50th percentiles for any of the schools that they want to go to. They see that they're excluded from that, and they think that it's going to hurt them when they put that in. But in reality, a number of different factors are going to be looked at. That same 1450 was coming from, I think of the New Jersey schools near David, somewhere where you've got a 1350 or 1400 as your average, it's going to be viewed as a mediocre addition to the application. So the College Board actually has a software called Landscape that is available to the admissions officers, that with every score is reporting this really deluge of data on top of that score to help contextualize it and make it so that it's better, that it's not just a single number. And we look at that score in the context of a larger, socioeconomic and just general social factors, just to list a couple of the things that are being provided. So first, each score on a personal level is going to be related directly to the averages coming from other students at that school. Basic high school data is going to be provided. So this is the location. This is, in that locations category. So rural, small city, large city, general economic factors like the number of students receiving discounted or free lunches, the size of the class, the average number of APs taken, the average grade on APs, on AP tests at that school, college attendance, household structure, median family income, housing stability, the list goes on and on and on. So all of these are factors that add color to that score, and indicate, okay, is this something that supports this application or something that hinders it? And this is the idea of score strength. And this is really the way that score is a fundamental element in equity. And this is why that Dartmouth, Yale, and many of the others talked about equity. Is the idea is that, okay, if everybody was looking at a 1350 as the same score, whoever it comes from, yes, that would probably penalize certain groups, because according to the landscape of American education, different social groups perform better or worse than others. However, when we're looking at it in context, all of a sudden, here's just one more piece of data that a student can use to demonstrate their academic excellence and their preparedness for college.
So that's very interesting. And already I see there's all sorts of questions coming up. So is this term score strength, is this going to be used by more colleges? Is this going to become a term that's part of the vernacular as we go forward? That's one question. And then my other question is are all high schools represented on this landscape? Like, I'm thinking about here where I am in Central California. I have a lot of high schools who, my students are lucky if they get 900s on the SAT. So are they, how broad is landscape? And then there's a third question that people already have. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But
So landscape, and I'm open to people who can correct me on this, but I'm pretty sure that landscape is just the most current model, the most current tool that College Board uses to share information that historically it's shared with admissions offices, with colleges. And yeah, they hit all the high schools. They're focusing, when you're talking about kind of schools by you, Cyndy, that maybe students aren't, don't have access to all of the deepest educational resources. Those are the kind of schools that would definitely be represented in landscape. And a lot of college admissions offices use this data. They appreciate the fact that this data exists and that they can use it.
Yeah, I mean, landscape is really the premise and the best tool for the holistic admissions process. So every single college in the country does holistic admissions. They're not just viewing a score or a grade in isolation. They actually want the tool, Cyndy, to your point, for those schools where the average is a 900, so that if a kid gets a 1300, they can see, hey, that's 3 standard deviations higher than the average. A 1300 might be very low compared to Yale's median, but it puts the student in a 0.1 percentile of their school. That's exactly the type of student that Yale wants. That's why Yale and especially other top colleges are using holistic admissions and are using that landscape from College Board.
oh, well, you guys are, I am not an advocate for testing because I've seen the whole gamut, but you're moving me forward. This is very interesting.
To be really quickly, the ACE, so we say College Board, and College Board is who provides landscape. The ACT is taken in and worked through concordance tables, the official concordance tables from 2018, in the context of landscape as well. So this is not just, this is any, I don't think that they, well, they do provide data on AP tests as well, but any standardized test, it's being contextualized. It's not a black and white situation at all.
And that's important. That, I think that is the key. And then that takes us back to one of those reasons. And I see Monica, and I'm sure other people are asking, can you relist the 3 reasons that they went back to test prep? So transparency was one.
Transparency, the divergent performance between students who did and did not submit, especially when you do apples to apples comparisons. So there are really only 2 studies that are cited by people who don't want test scores used in admissions. It's Defining Promise, and it's the University of Chicago study. The other wealth of data, we're talking about decades of research covering millions of students, has always shown when you do the statistical comparison correctly, again, apples to apples, students in the same major, there's always a statistically significant difference. So again, if you want to be admitting students who are the most academically prepared, who are going to succeed the most in your institution, at least you would think test scores would be part of the puzzle when they give such good information. And then the last piece was the equity piece, that, again, MIT has said they found it hard to find those students who would stick out from their context, because you take that student who comes from a school where the average is 900 and they have straight A's, you don't know that they're prepared for Yale. You get that 1300 from them, boom, they are just absolutely stellar. That they can do it at Yale. So,
And I just want to add a factor that comes out from what David's saying, and I want to use a phrase that we know what it means, but just to clarify the value of the test scores as context is college readiness. Is to say that a student's grades are not meant necessarily as an indicator of college readiness, in that, the high school history teacher, the high school pre-calculus teacher, the job of that teacher is not to establish college readiness. The job of the teacher is very specifically to instruct students in front of them, meet a lot of state, district requirements. I mean, teachers in schools have enough work on their plates, we don't need to give them also the determination to say that your grades have to predict college readiness. They don't need to do that because there are instruments that are designed to do that and have consistently done that over decades.
I think that's a really good point, Mike, and I think that's important for all of us to bring that concept back into the whole conversation. Is what does qualifies as college ready, and that includes mental health and neurodivergent students and all these other aspects too. One of the questions that I see, and I know everybody's thinking this, is how can we as counselors and advisors see landscape? Is that something we can get those reports? Can we create an account and see that?
We added a link to landscape in the chat, and it's a higher ed tool. So my understanding is that you cannot see it, but you can certainly, as an IEC, reach out to some of your colleagues in the admissions offices and talk to them about the data that they're seeing.
Is there something similar in Slate, though? I mean, we can set up accounts in Slate and see our students. And I know Slate is something that a lot of colleges use.
That's a great question. It's possible. I mean, there might be a hook between Slate and the data, in which case everyone can access it. You're the professional, Cyndy. I don't know as much about your English.
I have people in the audience who I have a feeling will go and find out. I'm looking at Kate. I'm looking at a few people that I know. So I want to go back to the concept of grades versus testing. And you hit on grade inflation. How much do you think grade inflation has driven this reemergence of the importance of testing and the conversation and reviewing the data? Because that's one of the things we found after COVID. You're only looking at tests. I mean, you're only looking at grades. Well, everybody has a 4.0, so then that doesn't give you anything to compare to. At least with the test scores, you can see whether you're in the middle, at the top, or the bottom, and it gives you a much more accurate perspective. So what about test and grade inflation?
Yeah, so we hear a lot about that. But so I want to put some numbers on it because we hear so much about it. So what I look most at is the UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute College Freshman Survey. So that goes back to 1966. So in 1966, it was 20% of students had an A average who were going on to a 4-year BA granting university. 20% A average, 80% didn't have an A average. Now you look at 2022, the last year that there was data available, it was 80% had an A average, 20% didn't have an A average. So objectively, grades are far, far more inflated. And so that becomes really difficult for parents to wrap their minds around, where, an A average used to be like, all right, you're crushing it. You're on honor roll. You're on high honor roll. You're doing great. It's really hard as tutors when families will come to us and be like, look, my child, they're a good student. They're an honor roll student. They get, A average, and they're just not a good test taker. They have a 20 on the ACT. To us, what we see is, well, that is average based on the grades, assuming the average high school, right? High schools vary in their difficulty. And a 20 is average for the ACT. So that's actually like they're at where we would think that they are. So it can be a very hard dose of reality when for 11 years of schooling, a student and their parent have thought, I'm crushing it. I'm on honor roll. And the average student at their school is on honor roll, and they get a 20 on the ACT, and they're just totally deflated. Really, that shows that, that's a generalized comparative metric. So long story short, grades are very inflated, and it's something that I hope people better understand.
And just to add to that, we've known about grade inflation for a long time. Professor Seth Gershenson, he released a study on grade inflation in high schools that was from 2005 to 2016. And a really important point he made about grade inflation was that it was inequitable. The students in the higher socioeconomic brackets, the students who went to private schools, were more likely to benefit from grade inflation. And it was just another way that we say we want to understand the numbers and find ways to present information and take out some of that privilege, take out some of the where the all the odds seem to be favoring certain people.
That's it.
And piggybacking as well, one of the issues beyond even the GPA is that, you know, and talking about honor roll, that kind of thing, is just understanding the system of standard versus honors courses versus AP. So many parents at this point, when they hear honors courses, to them, that is just, you know, the highest possible rigor. And really, unless we're seeing AP courses with good scores on those AP tests at the end of them, it is not really a high rigor curriculum. And so we are often the bearer of bad news, unfortunately, in the test prep industry, saying, look, I'm sorry, you know, somehow this wasn't brought up to you by sort of putting against this backdrop of all of the other students in, you know, across the country, but the level of academic rigor of your students' achievements in school is not particularly high. You know, 17 years into their into their life here is the first time they'll hear it from us, unfortunately.
Yeah, I bet you have quite a job convincing them of that.
I mean, it's interesting because this is all of the issues that we're talking about, all of the complaints, all of the concerns relate to just American education, right?
Mhm.
We don't have a national test. We don't have a national curriculum. And educational priorities vary from state to state, district to district, and family to family. And just from the very beginning, the minute we wanted to get rid of any assessment that was applied equally to all of our students, we lost the ability to evaluate the students that needed the help. It's, you know, regardless of what you think of the SAT or ACT, you can't argue with the idea that standardized tests have a role, that you need, just like, you know, in New York State, we have a driving test. There is the same written test and road test that everybody takes. And whether I think I'm a good driver or not, if if the person who is in charge of giving me a license says, no, you're not a good driver, I have to go with that. And then I have to learn exactly what the governing body, the licensing body, tells me I should know. It's a very formal system in some areas. In American education, it's completely ad hoc. It's cobbled together by all different kinds of organizations, nonprofits for the most part, working together and just creating pieces. So, you know, the tests that we're talking about today have been one piece of an elaborate mechanism that's designed ideally to get the right students into the environments where they are going to thrive.
Mhm. Well, that's very interesting. Looks like I can see we have a number of questions. So this
Yeah.
does generate a lot of conversation and perspective for sure.
Quite a bit of questions, and I think you touched on it a bit, Mike, but can you explain what you mean by grade inflation benefiting higher socioeconomic students more? Do you mean that their grades are more likely to be inflated?
Yes. Not to say that, you know, if a student goes to a private school, that student is guaranteed inflated grades. It's to say that, so I don't want to show my age here, but I think some of us remember a time when an A meant something and that it was possible to get a C in school. And there's a famous two-panel editorial cartoon that always comes to mind when we talk about this topic. And it's back in the old days, if the student had a problem in class and the teacher wrote a note to the parent saying, like, you know, the student's not working, you would have the teacher and the parent on one side of the desk saying to the student, what are you doing wrong? Why are you doing this? But today in a lot of schools, if the student is struggling, if the student is failing, let's not say struggling, let's say not doing assignments, not doing the work, parents will advocate for the student. Today, the parent is on the side of the student yelling at the teacher, why did you fail the student? In that, it's a lot easier in environments where parents are they have the time and the resources to advocate strenuously, when they're tapped into a sense that a B plus could ruin a student's future, right? Like it sounds hilarious because that's not true. It's not, but it's to say everything is riding on getting all A's to be able to get into the most selective schools, and parents exert tremendous pressure on teachers and administrators, and the administrators put the pressure on the teachers. I think we all know teachers. I think we all personally have friends who are teachers, and they can speak to this in their classrooms, and it just happens to be. And I'll share the link to Gershensen's study, but remember, this was pre-pandemic. This was before things really blew up. But that in certain environments, if you were in certain socioeconomic strata, you were more likely to benefit. You had the ability to benefit from that.
And it makes sense too, right? Because in the cases where the parent is yelling at the teacher, right? At a private school, you are a client, right? You're saying that you're unhappy with the product that you've purchased, right? Whereas there isn't necessarily, other than making somebody's life miserable, there isn't necessarily the same kind of gravitas to somebody yelling at a public school employee.
That's true. So I see, and Monica asked a very good question, and she's overseas. Does the landscape cover international schools, high schools as well, secondary schools?
Presumably, landscape covers all of the schools where students take the SAT, but I can't speak to that.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's a good question. So looks like here's another question. I'm going to go ahead and lob this, Carmen. Tests are just one factor in a holistic review, and this connects to the next question I was going to ask. While maybe not ideal, tests are standard. Selective colleges can view test scores in context of the school profiles, just like GPA and vigor. Without test scores, families who can afford it can spend more on tutoring. Right now, a big issue in places like California, and this has come up and a couple of comments, is the inability to find test locations. I will share with you, I had a conversation with a parent this week. Her daughter is a senior, and mom pushed in California. She pushed to have her daughter go take the SAT last year, and the counselor told her flat out, you don't need to do that, and would not. They don't offer it. They didn't offer it, and they don't offer it. So this is a big issue, especially like not just California, but other states, is access to the testing. So is there, what's the status on that?
We can definitely speak to that.
Test dates for
so we've done the homework on this, that the issue of finding test centers for students has long been a function of professionals in our industry. Through the pandemic, when students weren't able to find locations, many of us were concierges. We were like, oh, go to this school, they're more likely to stay open, go to this school. But, as the National Test Prep Association has taken a more formal role as an advocate, we've connected with Collegeboard, we've connected with ACT, we've spoken to parents and students, stakeholders all over to try to find the root cause. Why are there so few test centers in California? Why is it that across the country, as you point, Cyndy, just 2 weeks ago, just the week going into the August SAT, lots of students got notifications, sometimes in the middle of the night before the morning of the SAT, your test location has been canceled. Guess what? Collegeboard isn't doing that. ACT isn't deciding to cancel the test at the last minute. It's happening, and I hate to be the one to say this, it's happening at the school level. And David and I, we had a fantastic conversation with Sebastian Gilmore. Does anybody remember the LA Times op-ed that came out a couple of months ago, written by a student in California? I live in Northern California. Why should I have to travel to Texas to take the SAT? That was Sebastian. And we spoke to him, and he talk about an amazing teen, right? Talk about the kind of student that all of us love to meet in our educational journeys, because he saw a problem and he took action, and he's still taking action. He's still trying to advocate on the student and district level to get schools to embrace their responsibility in offering these locations. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. it's, you know, I can't defend a school in my area. I'm in upstate New York, right? And I understand how hard it is to staff a test center in August when your schools aren't open until after Labor Day. But at the end of the day, lots of students are really depending on that opportunity. And when schools decide at the last minute to cancel because they can't staff it, or they decide not to offer it at all, we have real issues of opportunity. We have real issues that impact students' applications when we have seniors that are hoping to apply early decision and they were counting on an August test and they can't get to that. Now there are fewer opportunities, and it's also a real equity issue. David, would you agree?
So-
Completely.
sorry.
And
Um,
you can go, Mac. I'll go after.
So I was just going to add on. So this is, and I think that, so College Board has been doing a massive amount to try to solve. I'm not sure about the ACT side of it, but we've been in conversations with College Board. They've been doing a massive amount of work to try to make things happen out in California. And I'm really proud of what the role that NTPA has had in that. We interfaced with College Board at our recent, over the summer, we interfaced with College Board about these issues. And directly as a result of that interaction, you may have noticed at some point 10,000 seats were added to the August test in California. And this was directly as a relationship of us talking about how bad the situation was. So they very much want to help. I know that for a fact that they have gone so far as to do things like offer staffing, particularly with these the vendors at hotels, these kinds of things that they've been working with. That has been a huge problem in falling through. One thing I wanted to say was a conversation that we in NTPA have been having is it may not necessarily also be only schools' responsibility. So it is absolutely, so I think at least that schools should have a responsibility to their students to open them to this opportunity. But for example, Stanford is saying that they want test scores, but they have enormous auditoriums with wonderful Wi-Fi and everything you possibly need to run a standardized test, but they're not offering to offer standardized tests. So the people who are benefiting most from these tests are not necessarily offering to help the situation. So as a community as a whole, we can necessarily look for possible ways to remedy the situation if the schools themselves don't want to support this.
So can I just add one thing? So, I mean, again, we could actually do like a whole podcast on this.
Yeah.
But so
I noticed.
So
this is a very important point.
So, I mean, I've talked to College Board, and they've actually shown me the numbers on how much it costs for them when they host a site, right? When they have to rent a hotel and things like that. I asked them if I could share that publicly. They said no. But suffice to say, they take a significant loss on every student that they offer a test to when it's a pop-up site. The only way that you can make it work economically, if you're going to have the SAT actually pay for itself, is to hire the proctors from the schools, which is what they currently do. So if we want national access to the SAT and ACT, it has to be done through the schools. The only other alternative is to do a GRE, GMAT, LSAT model, where you're talking $250 per test. You go to a Prometric center. So if we don't want the test to be $250, we want them to be $60, then we have to do them through schools. And it has to be the schools saying, we want this opportunity for our kids. The other thing is that 20% of students take the SAT and ACT for free. 20%. If you're on free or reduced lunch, you take the test for free. So these schools, these under-resourced schools, yes, I understand it's difficult, but these are very important tests for these students. The proctors are paid, the coordinators are paid. Maybe it's not enough, but these kids need access to these tests. These high schools can provide that access because it's not just about getting into school. It's also about affording it. Because at so many of these schools, you get automatic scholarships and money if you get a certain score. So that's why we're trying to talk to people like Sebastian and nonprofits in California saying, hey, please approach these high schools. Just encourage them to give this access to their students. So that's really the only feasible way that we can do it within, this time frame. So that's why we're trying to reach out to just anyone we can to get the word out about that.
Well, and it's an ongoing effort. And I think it's going to take some time to see those efforts pay off. And that's why at least it's nice to see, like Carnegie Mellon, some of these schools saying, well, in the next class that this is going to be, because at least it gives them a year. But those that said for this class, then students are put in a bind, particularly in states like California, where my students have to go out of state to even find it testing. Because the whole concept within a public school system is that our public schools do not require the test. I can go to UCLA, I can go to UC Berkeley and not take an SAT or ACT. So, and because of all those reasons you cited, I can see where the high schools aren't offering it. Because if it's not required, my students still can go to the public schools. We're not going to do that time and effort and expense as well. So there is a lot of work to do on that regard. So, Carmen, you had a question.
Yeah, so there is just a bit of discussion kind of over the labor aspect of this. Are the facilities and IT staff also paid for their time to come in over the weekend?
I mean, the conversations in the chat, Jeff Eisenberg points out that it's not like proctors are paid $50 an hour. They're paid a small amount to sit there and basically sit and read. I mean, it's important work. It's critical work to get the test started, to make sure that these tests adhere to standardized conditions so that it's fair for everybody. Again, these are relationships that College Board and ACT have had with schools for decades.
Mm-hmm.
If it's time for, public schools or schools to renegotiate their contracts, that's definitely something that's outside of our lane. Our position is simply, I think, the position that everybody has. Students from everywhere, including California, where even though the UC schools don't require tests, it's not as if students in California don't apply to other schools and apply outside that system.
Exactly.
It's that we see that public schools do all kinds of work to meet all kinds of needs for students who are seeking life, pursuing paths after high school, after secondary education, whether it's military, it's industry, it's career, it's higher education. And high schools do all of that. High schools offer tech programs. High schools invite military recruiters in. High schools host college reps coming in. That's just the role of the high school. That's the taxpayers support that in their areas. What we're talking about, how much is fair for College Board to pay for this, that's between the school districts and College Board. Like, a lot of these questions are well outside our sphere of influence. All we want is for students who want to be able to take tests to have access to tests within a reasonable distance. Whether you call that a mile, 5 miles, 10 miles, somewhere on a good public transportation route, whatever it is, there should just be access.
I just want to say a note about California. So one thing about the UC schools that's very misunderstood is that they call themselves test free. That's their words. But UC Berkeley, for instance, I mean, they just recently on a podcast, the assistant director of admissions there said they want AP exam scores and IB scores, and for international students, A-level scores. So they're not test free. They might be SAT, ACT free. How much is an AP exam test, though? It's like, what, $95 per exam? So if you're going to accrue lots of AP exam scores, that's more expensive than SAT, ACT scores. So, I mean, the idea that we could do admissions, highly selective competitive admissions without any objective criteria, even the test-free schools want test scores. That should basically tell you everything that you need to know for it. So I would just say that for these UC schools, the idea that they're test-free is not true, and and students, parents, college counselors, teachers need to understand that.
That's a very good point too. And it does seem like, especially here in California, the emphasis has shifted from SAT or ACT to the AP or IB. And we've just I knew this was going to be a great conversation and our hour was going to fly by. I was not surprised. So in closing, I would just like to hear from, I'm going to ask a two-part question. What advice, and just go to each of you, what advice would you give to counselors, advisors at this point in juncture of where we're at in the whole college admissions environment, from a test prep perspective? What advice? What should we know?
So for counselors, like private college counselors, school counselors, educators, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we have educators in all those different, even in community-based organizations, CBOs, and then what do we need to know about your organization, and how can we participate or support? So
I'll start
what do
the
we need
answer.
to know,
Yeah.
and how can we contribute? Those are my two questions. So David, let's start with you.
Sure. So the message that I want to get out to all students, all people, is that these are achievement tests. So they're testing students on the fundamentals of really important educational material that all students can benefit from. Is going to help by learning it. It's not just random that they're testing students on the fundamentals of mathematics and grammar. These are the things that they know, that they've studied. If students know these things, they're going to do better on average in college. And so I want all students to know they can do better on these exams. Not that they can game these exams through test prep. Anyone who says that, oh, you can game it through tests and tips and tricks, you should run from those people. Because there's over 200 topics tested on both the SAT and ACT. It is a lot of content, but it's not an infinite amount of content. Every single student, whether they're paying or not paying, can learn these concepts. There's nothing hidden on it. We're in the golden age of information. You can go on Khan Academy for free, learn see the questions that are going to, the real questions from the College Board, that those questions like it are going to show up on the real test. You can go to YouTube videos and learn how to use Desmos, which is on the new SAT. You can get inexpensive prep books. Yes, you can get a class or a private tutor, but again, it comes down to learning the knowledge and the skills needed to do better on these exams, which will help you do better in life. And that's open to everyone as long as they put the time in.
Great. Mike, what recommendations?
So I'm going to follow a recommendation that a lot of my local counselors share with their students. And I think it's just good advice to say that if a student is hoping to attend college, a student should take the SAT or ACT. Even if they don't need to submit it, it's a readiness test. Take the test. The College Board and ACT both print really clear college readiness benchmarks, which basically say that if you're below a certain threshold, your chances of passing your first year introductory classes is dangerously low. If we follow the National Student Clearinghouse data, then roughly 25% of students who apply to four-year school fail to make it to the second year. And we still have only 2/3 of students graduating after 6 or 7 years. Which is to say, nobody thinks it's going to be their teen who doesn't make it. But the numbers say that, 1 in 4 kids are not going to make it to the second year. 1 in 3 students will not graduate at all. The tests are valuable in that regard, the same way we consider any of these assessments. Whether you need them or not, whether you're going to act on that information or not, you should have a sense about whether you can use that. And then we'll come back to the NTPA after we hear from Mackenzie on this.
Okay.
So I think the biggest things that David used a trigger phrase for us all, which is tips and tricks. Tips and tricks. The number one thing that a counselor can do to support their student with respect to standardized tests is to disabuse them of the idea of tips and tricks. and disabuse them of the idea of a good test taker. So number one thing is just this growth mindset of, look, okay, it's absolutely true. Some component of our job is helping students understand strategy and opportunity cost of, should I continue, should I take this question or move on? But that's maybe 20, in my personal experience, 20 to 25% of what I'm teaching. Mostly what I'm teaching is punctuation, grammar, a discriminant and quadratic formulas. We're teaching material that they have already learned if they have gone through Algebra 2. Right? It's not this, these tests are not adding anything on top of what they have already learned. They've just forgotten it, often due to poor study skills, doing it the last minute, and then you forget it over a long period of time. And so what can best aid a student's journey through this is not emphasizing the idea of being a good or a poor test taker. It's simply a matter of, what do we need to do to learn the material that is on this test and be prepared for it? And there's an incredible broad range of different resources at this point. A lot of kids don't like to read anymore. There are wonderful workbooks, but then there are also, awesome video YouTube channels with all sorts of information that walk through things. The ACT and the SAT both provide a number of different practice tests that they have written, for which they have provided answer explanations. They're not the best answer explanations sometimes, but they're answer explanations. And if a student understands that concept from Algebra 2 or whatever it may be from, they would understand the explanation. So, this is something that blows my mind every time. We just had it with the August test, is students coming back and going, oh my gosh, what was this math section? What was this? This came out of nowhere. It didn't come out of nowhere. We know what's on these tests, and we know what's on it every time. And the SAT and ACT are both very transparent about what's on it. If you prepare, if you work through those practice tests that they've provided, you will know what's on it too, and you will know the extent to which you're prepared for it. So this growth mindset, moving away from, am I a good test taker or not, is really huge, because we want to support these students in their pathway here.
I think that's an important aspect, to just take that kind of out of their vernacular and focus on, everybody can succeed in these. You just need that refresher or preparation. One person, Maria, asked about free resources. Are there free, you're referring
Mackenzie
to
mentioned a bunch that, Collegeboard and ACT provide free resources. Khan Academy is fantastic. A lot of NTPA members create all kinds of videos on YouTube, right? Like there's all kinds of resources out there. And there have never been more quality free resources for test preparation than there are today.
And that leads us right back into the question about the organization. So what can people join? Is there a website? What's their next steps if they're interested in learning more about National College Test Prep Organization?
So the best way to find us is go to nationaltestprep.org. We're a nonprofit organization. We really care about helping students and their families. We have a directory that people can look at and look up, hey, is there someone who's a member of the National Test Prep Association near me? Or if not, a lot of us do virtual tutoring as well. At least then you're going with a vetted expert who's going to help guide you through the process.
And, if you're an IEC, then you should know that we created an organization in part to support you and to engage with you. Some of you may have met me at the last IECA conference. You might have met Mackenzie at the last HECA conference. We're really committed, and all of us work hand in hand. Professionals work with professionals to provide a continuum of care to support not just the students that they're directly working with, but their educational communities. And we invite all of those opportunities to help support what you do.
Well, thank you so much for being with me today. This has been a very lively and informative conversation, and filled with data. And I think that's one thing that we find really important, is because let's separate the feelings from the facts and have that opportunity. So you've given us a lot of food for thought on that. And I thank you very much for joining me. Next week, we're going to have Jasmine Gurley from the HBCUs, and we're going to talk about the impact of HBCU and education in society. So I'm looking forward to that. And then the Friday Forum is going to go on hiatus. So everybody's busy. Everybody's going to be working full strength with students. And so we'll come back the end of October and we're going to be talking about data again with athletes. So Katie Anderson, and there's going to be we're going to even have a bigger team than we had here today. So I'll be back October 25th. And in the meantime, you guys can reach me in Cornwall. So that's where I'm going to head in September. So everybody have a great weekend. Have a great Labor Day. And thank you again, Mackenzie, Mike, and David for being with me today. And Carmen, thanks for being here. I know you're back in New Jersey, back on the East Coast. So we're glad. And thank you everybody for being here today. I have the best audience of all. So have a good weekend.
Thanks, Cyndy.
Thank you.
Thanks.